This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by Geofrey Hildrew, whose work includes The Walking Dead, Carnival Row, and most recently Painkiller for Netflix, just to name a few. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Gordon.
I guess my first question for you is, how did you get involved with this project?
Yeah, so I got involved with this project through Eric Newman, who was one of the producers on the show, who also produced the Netflix series Narcos. And this is my second collaboration with Eric, who I previously worked on a show called True Story with Kevin Hart and Wesley Snipes that was on last year. And I came to that project through a good friend of mine who's a writer and director named Charles Murray, who I had met previously in some of my scripted television world, and I cut a few features for him over the past few years.
So one of the things that's really interesting in this is that every episode opens with families telling their story, like actual families who've been affected by this crisis. Was that an idea from the start, or is that something that came about in the cutting room?
Yeah, so that was a very, very late addition to the project. We needed to start the show is based on true events, but for dramatic purposes, there are certain things that are fictionalized, and we needed to have a disclaimer at the top of the episodes. So we were trying to figure out how to best do that, and very late in the game, Pete had this idea to do with real families and how they were affected. And a little bit of backstory about myself. I lost my 3-year-old son 4 years ago, rather unexpectedly.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And through that experience, I came to connect with a group called the Compassionate Friends, which is a grief support group for parents who have lost children and also siblings who have lost their siblings. And I got to know firsthand so many people who lost loved ones due to the opioid crisis. So that added an extra level of connection kind of to the storyline and made it even more important. It made it more important to me. So when Pete had that idea, it just, it affected me in really profound ways, because, the way that those introductions happen, it's much like the beginning of one of our grief groups. It's very raw and emotional, and people are connecting and telling their story, which is really the hardest part of each of our monthly meetings when we're connecting and telling our stories.
I think what attracted me to color correction was the fact that we were like the next stage of cinematography. And the creative side was huge, trying to understand what was wrong with an image, how to balance it, trying to understand how to let the tools do what you want them to do. Where else can the technology go? What else can we do? I'm very interested in trying to mold the image and create the best look possible. And whatever tools are out there, you want to try and latch onto them. I'm Eric Whipp, and this is my course on color correction.
Well, and what's interesting about it, when it like caught me off guard the first time it happened. And then, but like what I find interesting about it is that it situates you, or it creates, like it sets the tone for the show, like, and it sort of puts it into perspective, because a lot of times people just see like based on true stories or what have you, and they're like, okay, and they just sort of let it fly over them. But then this sort of situates it like, this is real, like a lot of this has happened.
Yeah, it's very real. And I think we play with tone a lot over the course of the series. I think, even just in the first episode, I think you pick up on that very quickly. So I think where Pete was really smart with that idea was, to say, this is an idea, this is something that's very real and affecting people in a very real way. And as we go through the series, we might start playing with ideas and concepts and experimenting a little bit tonally, because ultimately it is a TV show, and it needs to have there needs to be a way to entertain the audience also. But as Eric Newman says, this is such an important story. It just needs to be told as many times as it can be.
Now you cut the pilot, and whenever I've talked to editors about editing pilots, it's usually, I don't want to say it's a struggle, but it is one of the tougher parts of a series, because you're setting the stage for every other episode and how things are going to look and how the story is going to progress. So what were some of the challenges of editing the first episode?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on very quickly. I think there's a lot of information to digest. There's a lot of characters. There's a lot of simultaneous storylines. There's a lot of tonal shifts. So I think the challenges were sort of as a editor, those challenges were sort of how do I say it? They were sort of a joy or a luxury. It's not something you have a chance to play with so much in the cutting room. So it was just finding that balance of how and when to introduce all those different threads and what the right balance was. Yeah, I know sometimes, with simultaneous storylines, it's easy to get overwhelmed and figure out, well, how am I going to situate the audience, and how am I going to make sure all of this stuff is clear? But before this, I worked for 7 years on a series called Once Upon a Time for ABC, and it couldn't, that series tonally couldn't be more different than what we're doing with Painkiller, but it was a lot of characters, a lot of timelines, flipping forward and backward, and present day and past day and future, and even some sort of multiverse type concepts at certain points. So I felt very comfortable working in that world. But Pete was really great about inviting myself and my colleague Garrett Donnelly, who edited the Even episodes, to just experiment and play and take our time to kind of get it right.
Well, and it's always interesting to me because you have all these sort of positions or these sort of storylines, like you were saying, you can also move them around. So was there any part of these, like any scene that got shifted earlier in the episode or later or anything like that?
Yeah, episode 1's a great example of that, because I already talked about the disclaimers, that being a very late addition, but and I already, I discussed, there's a lot of information and a lot of characters to start introducing ourselves into. And Uzo, who is sort of our reluctant storyteller, narrating her experience with the epidemic, starts this story. And she's a brilliant actress and so strong that we knew that she was going to be able to carry this series. But because we're taking such big swings and shifting around experimentally also, I think we needed to figure out a way to start easing the audience into some of the stylistic changes that we were going to take. So very early in the process, Eric and Pete came into the cutting room and had this idea about moving the smoke detector scene up to the top of episode 1. And I think, maybe we met the idea with a little bit of reluctance or skepticism at first, but when we did that, I think we all sat back and said, well, this distinguishes us, and this kind of sets the tone for where we can go, and eases the audience kind of into some of those big swings that we're going to take later on, and does so in an interesting way. And I think also, sort of illuminates something maybe about the character and the personality of Richard Sackler.
Well, and what's fascinating about that is I 100% thought it was written that way. Like, it just felt like an opening. It felt like a way to introduce the character and bring us into the story. which is very interesting. The other character I wanted to talk to you about is Glenn, the mechanic.
Yeah.
And I found the way you approached the him getting hurt very interesting, because it almost feels like a misdirect, where with the bucket being sort of, teased like a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah.
So how can you tell me about how you approached the scene for the misdirect? Was it always there? Was it something you heightened or anything like that?
Yeah, so thank you for saying that. I that's one of my favorite scenes, I think, in the entire series.
Mhm.
And I think Pete did a brilliant job of blocking that sequence, because I think any smart audience member knows as soon as they see that excavator that something bad's probably going to happen.
Yeah,
So
that's what was so interesting about it.
yeah. So as soon as you see it, it's like this ticking clock in the background. It's like, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. When is it going to happen? How's it going to happen? And I think by the end, it sort of happens in an unexpected way. But it's so great because those scenes came very late in the editorial process and in the shooting schedule. And I think when we started getting the material with Taylor, immediately, we knew we had the emotional heart of the series. And when you meet Glenn in that opening scene, very quickly, you learn so much about him, what his life is like, what his family dynamic is like, what the struggles of running a small business are, and how devastating, when that injury does happen to him, how devastating that's going to be and affect his family and his life.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I give a lot of credit to Pete, the way he constructed that blocking. I just think it's really intense and amazing.
No, the show is based on, or is sort of inspired by a documentary as well called The Crime of the Century. Did you watch that before cutting this?
I had seen pieces of it. I hadn't watched it all the way through, and sometimes I specifically try not to, because I don't want to be too influenced by other by storytelling conventions.
Mhm.
I think it was actually later on that I started watching some of that stuff, especially as we were getting towards building episode 5, which is the Miami sequence, because it's based on a real event. Like, that convention
Mhm.
really happened, and it, from what we understand, got kind of crazy and out there. And so I looked at that for some inspiration, I think, later on as we were trying to do that. Also, we talked really early on. Pete's a big fan of a movie by Paolo Sorrentino called The Great Beauty.
Mhm.
And there's this opening sequence. It's this fabulous party, and it's just these close-ups and intense cutting, and these grotesque faces and characters. And I think we used that sort of as inspiration for how we were going to present that sequence.
Oh, very interesting. Now the other sequence that sort of stood out for me in this, I mean, the surgeries and the lobotomies, I had to close my eyes, so I can't ask you anything about those. But the moment where Arthur goes to the hospital it's I don't know how to describe the cutting, because it's a very interesting approach in sort of like him, like going back and forth between nurses and doctors and trying to explain to them. Can you tell me how you approach this, or where the inspiration for editing it this way came from?
Yeah, so I think most of the storylines in this, or most of the scenes in this, I think we started from a place of, what do we want the audience to experience? And we wanted to create this experience of what it's like to be kind of in the middle of this whole chaotic story. And each character, I think, sort of, there's sort of 4 storylines that we're following in this. And each character sort of has a different access point into the cotton story. We talked about Glenn already, and I think Glenn's story, Glenn is sort of, the stylistically, the way that we sort of present his story is more linear. And I think, even though there's that ticking clock and that excavator in the background, Glenn is new to the story.
Mhm.
Richard, I think, Richard Sackler and his uncle Arthur, which we just talked about, they are the story. So I think we, maybe the word is there's a more whimsical style and a whimsical way that we introduce them, because
Mhm.
they're kind of in the middle of this whole, circus. They're the ringleaders. So I think that was sort of an intentional way to approach that material.
Was there a particular scene or moment in the series that was difficult for you to edit, or something that you had to overcome, but you're really proud of the outcome?
Difficult. I don't know if I'd like. I
Yeah,
don't know.
maybe the
Difficult to
word
word that I
difficult,
like, but it was
but
like,
challenging.
but it really was a joy. I would say more than anything I've ever cut before, I had so much fun working on this project from an editorial standpoint, just because we were able to play with the material so much and
Mhm.
really find the tone for each individual moment and story beat and how best to present that. And I mean, there are scenes where we have, without exaggeration, hundreds and hundreds of versions as we were playing with things. One example in episode 1 is the pleasure and pain montage, when
Mhm.
after the will reading, when Richard's talking to his uncle and try to convince them, that he's got this vision. And we went through many, many, many iterations of how to present that. And some of them went very, very extreme with visuals and graphics and what that would be. And I think, Pete always had a great governor for pushing us as far as we could with the material. And every time we would have something, we were super proud, like, this is the one. He'd be like, no, take it further, further. He sort of had this mantra in the cutting room that I like to say, like, be fearless. That was what he would say to us every day: be fearless, be fearless. So we'd push things as far as we could, and when we would get there to the breaking point, he would be like, okay, now let's pull it back. And then and that's sort of, I think, how we kind of got to a happy medium and sort of were able to perfect a lot of those sequences.
Now, you mentioned the will reading, and I do have one question. That when Richard talks to the other two guys and sort of explains the pain pleasure sort of dichotomy, when they realize they can make more money, they start doing like a little dance. Was
Yeah,
that something the actors just decided to do? Is that something Pete suggested? Like, how did that end up in
I
there?
think it was a Pete suggestion. And, that's, one of the reasons that I think Pete is such a brilliant filmmaker is because he's so versatile. He's known, I think primarily as a a feature director, who tends to gravitate towards, these big action kind of based stories.
Mhm.
But he's also a documentarian, and he's also an actor. So I think all of those skill sets sort of found their place in this series. And because he has a background in acting, he's really willing to experiment and play and do some improvisational things that kind of sometimes in daily seem very outside the box. But the more you embrace those ideas and explore what's behind them and what they could be, it's really sort of a joyful toy box to play with.
Yeah, because at first they start their dance, and I was like, "Are they dancing?"
Yeah.
Like, because you're far away, and I was like, "Wait a second, or are they just shaking?" And then all of a sudden, you're
Yeah.
like, "Okay, I see what they're doing."
Yeah.
No, because he's an actor, how does that, do you think his approach in the cutting room changed because of that? Or do you think, is it similar to other directors?
I don't know that his I don't know that his approach in the cutting room changed. Like this isn't the first thing that he's directed for TV, and he's clearly has an accomplished career as a feature director, and as I said, also a documentarian. So I think I think he's very I think he's very conscious of what he wants the experience in each of those moments to be, and he's willing to let us play and experiment with that until he feels, until he feels what he's trying to feel, in dailies, sometimes we'd get a little bit of insight to that, because in addition to some of that improvisation, a lot of times people play music on set to help try and set a tone and an atmosphere. And I think that was a great insight into like, what is he feeling on the day, or how is he approaching this? How is he approaching this, with his director hat on? So, and we would, sometimes those ideas would shift, quite dramatically once we got to the cutting room, but it was a great starting point. It's a great kind of peek inside his mind.
It's interesting that you would say that, because the big chill, the director gave the actors a playlist for the script. So like, as you're reading, here's the music I want you to listen to. Was it something similar, like here's the tone playlist, or was it just something you heard when the rushes came in?
No, I think it was much more spontaneous, because it wasn't, it wouldn't always be the same song. Sometimes the tone and the song would shift, tremendously on set. You'd be like, okay, well, you think where he's coming from, and then, oh, we're trying this idea now. But that was also great from an editorial standpoint, because sometimes you'd have these great tonal shifts within a scene, and it gave you a place to build to, or a way to approach the material in a way that was very unexpected and surprising.
Now, I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
My favorite film of all time is Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Okay. What is it about that? Just obviously it's a classic, but
it's a classic, and I mean, it feels cliche to say, but what I love about that movie is, especially for its time period, it is a movie that I can watch, and every time I watch it, it just feels like pure cinema. And there's a 20-minute sequence in that. I think it's 20 minutes or so, where Jimmy Stewart is following the girl around, and he like follows her to the museum and around like in a day in the life, and there's no dialogue. It's just pure cinema. And I think I grew up sort of in rural Pennsylvania, and I didn't really have access to fine cinema growing up. A lot of it was just watching genre films or Hollywood blockbusters that I could get in my local cinema or video store. And I didn't really have an exposure to fine cinema till I got to college. And I remember seeing that for the first time and being like, wow, this is just, this is what it's all about. So I always go back to Vertigo.
But if I'm not mistaken, you sort of mentored under Barbara DeFina with Martin Scorsese. Now he is a cinephile. So did he just like download a bunch of films for you to watch?
Yeah, so that was when I was in college, I interned for Barbara DeFina at Martin Scorsese's company, and it was a amazing experience. I was primarily in development, but it was around for post-production on Kundun, and I was around for production on Bringing Out the Dead, and then some pre-production on Gangs of New York. So just to kind of be a fly on the wall, and just, I didn't have a tremendous amount of one-on-one interaction with Martin Scorsese, but like, he'd always be around, and he could sit there and tell you a story about his, afternoon lunch, and you'd be like on the edge of your seat. And then what happened? And then what happened? And then, and he had, at the time he had a giant film library, and he just had a staff of people that would sit there and record movies off of the DirecTV and satellite all day long. And these vaults and vaults of movies, and a screening room. Just, I didn't have an opportunity really to watch movies with him, but just to see his enthusiasm and his ability to collect his ability and knowledge and kind of awareness of just things that I had never heard of or seen. It was just absolutely amazing. As an intern there, one of the things that I would have to do periodically would be like go to the Museum of Modern Art to check out film prints that were his, that he had on lent there. I was like, wow, Martin Scorsese has a library card to the Museum of Modern Art. Like, how cool is that?
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time.
And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com and, of course, on Twitter at filmmaker_you. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs.